What's up guys, Tyler Yasuda here with Tytaniumfitness, and in this video we're going to talk about squatting. More specifically, we're going to talk about hip shooting up and back, bar path pitching forward, torsos folding over, and knees caving in out of the bottom of the squat. Now I know that sounds like a lot of stuff to cover in one video, but my idea is that all these issues are somewhat related. And these are issues that most of us probably struggle with in our squat. Even a lot of the top level powerlifters, the people who are the strongest, who are also the most technically aware, even people at that level still struggle with this issue. Before I start explaining things, if you haven't already seen my other squat biomechanics videos, I highly encourage you to go watch those first. I'm not joking. If you haven't seen them, pause the video now. I'll put links across the screen. Click on those links and watch those videos first, because if you haven't seen them, out of context, a lot of this stuff might not make any sense. So let's start first by taking a look at a bunch of examples. The reason I have so many examples is just because I know that we're all built differently, and seeing somebody of different proportions might help you guys see or recognize the issue and relate to it. What you should watch for in these examples is, like we said, hip shooting up and back, torsos folding over, and bar pitching forward, or in the more severe examples, we use the bar pitch forward. And I think I only have one clip from the front, but you'll notice knees caving in as well. And I'll explain why those are related later on. So now that you know what this error looks like, we're going to discuss why it's inefficient. And in order to do that, I have to draw some stick figures. What we have here is basically on the left side, a pretty standard position, bottom position of the squat, and on the right side is this position that a lot of us find ourselves in a few inches into our ascent. Obviously this side is exaggerated for the sake of explanation, but let's just take a look at the common themes that we see over here, or in this error that we see in our squat. Basically you'll notice that the hips translate up and back, so the hips are shot up and back, and also as our knees cave in, this apparent length here becomes longer over here, because as your knees collapse inward, that apparent femur length increases. The final common theme that we see is your spine here basically tilts forward more, so it becomes closer to horizontal. Now just really quick review, we know the formula is force equals mass times acceleration. In our case, mass is going to be the weight on the bar, which is going to be held constant. Acceleration is just the acceleration due to gravity. So both of those are going to be held constant. So force is going to be a constant in these examples. The other equation we're concerning ourselves with is torque. So torque is a product of force and lever arm length. Lever arm length is just the distance, the perpendicular distance between the application of force and the axis of rotation. So if we take a look over here, for example, at the knee, the lever arm length is going to be from here straight across to here. So it's going to be perpendicular, so the perpendicular distance from the application of force, which in this case is going to be the bar path, to the axis of rotation at the knee there. So that is the lever arm length for the knee, and conversely you could say from the hip would be from here to here, perpendicular. So what determines how hard a squat is going to be is how much torque we have to produce at each axis of rotation. So when we talk about torque, we are essentially defining the amount of force that the muscles acting on that axis of rotation have to produce in order to move the bar upward. For example, the torque requirement at the hip, if let's say that torque requirement is 500 Newton meters, in order for us to continue to extend our hip or continue to move the bar upward by extending at the hip, we would have to produce 500 Newton meters of force between our glutes, hamstrings, and erectors, or whatever other associated muscles there are acting at that axis of rotation. So the main point of all that is just that the higher the torque requirement, the harder the squat is going to be, regardless of the weight. We've already figured out, this certain lever arm length here from the knee. There's going to be another lever arm length from here, the hip, across perpendicularly. And then comparing these, these are both fairly short lever arms. So that means the torque requirement at both axes of rotation is fairly small. So now over here, if we just pretend for the moment that this bar, the blue circle, remained on the bar path, or the ideal bar path that's represented by the red dotted line, then basically the application of force will still be this red line. Obviously, there is no lever arm length at the knee anymore, because that axis of rotation is now in line with the application of force. On the other hand, if we take a look at the axis of the hip, what we notice is that this lever arm length here has increased by quite a bit from this side. What that means effectively is that since force stays constant in both instances, the lever arm length is the only thing that we're changing. So at the knee, we've basically made it a lot easier because the torque requirement is less at the knee, since there is a shorter lever arm. But at the hip, we have increased the torque requirement considerably by making that lever arm longer. So our next consideration has to be that whenever a muscle is producing force, it's going to be strongest or most effective at producing that force when it's closest to a full contraction. On the other hand, it's going to be weakest or worst at producing force when it is closer to being maximally stretched. A good example of this would be if you imagine setting up a low cable for bicep curls. The reason we're talking about a cable is just because the force curve is even regardless of the angle. If I told you to, put a pretty decent weight on there and you're going to do an isometric hold, if you come all the way up to the top where your elbow is in full flexion, your biceps are fully contracted, you do an isometric hold there. You just hold the cable there basically. That's going to be fairly easy for you. You could probably hold that for a pretty long time. On the other hand, if I told you to come up about a third of the way and do an isometric hold there, it's going to be much harder for you to hold it there because your bicep is going to be closer to a maximally stretched position. So the same thing applies to the muscles that are active in hip extension and knee extension. Hip extension and knee extension being the prime movements in a squat. Now if we take a look here at the angles of hip flexion, so H1, H2, and the angles of knee flexion, K1 and K2, we don't notice a huge difference in angle from H1 to H2. If anything, H2 might be slightly more acute, but the big difference that we notice is K1 to K2. K1 is very acute and K2 is much wider. Basically what that means is that in this position here, the amount of force that your knee extensors, your quads can produce is vastly limited by the angle of flexion. On the other hand, over here, because K2 is such a wide angle, or in comparison to K1 at least, your knee extensors, your quads, are in a much better position to produce force for knee extension. However, because the angle of H2, the angle from H1 to H2 became more acute, this is also at a much poorer position to produce force for hip extension. So overall, the reason that this position here is bad is because you have essentially increased the lever arm length here, which increases torque requirement, and you've also increased the angle of flexion here, which makes these muscles in a much worse position to produce force. I guess the last thing is also that as your hips shoot up and back, your tendency is going to be to fold forward this way, and your bar is going to tend to pitch forward as well. And if either of these happen, whether your torso tilts down or your bar path pitches forward, both of those are going to sort of create momentum in that direction. And in order to get the bar back on proper bar path and finish the lift, you do have to exert a certain amount of force in the opposite direction of the momentum in order to stop the momentum and get things back on track. If this is such a bad position, then why do so many of us find ourselves in this position or a similar position? And why do so many of the strongest people in the world still struggle with this? What it comes down to is comparing this position to this one. Our body is trying to find itself, or trying to find a position in which it has sufficient strength to move the bar upward. What you'll notice from this side to this side is that although your body changes position, the bar doesn't actually rise up that much. But what happens is, knowing what we do about changes in lever arm length and angles of flexion and how that influences both torque requirement and force production, if you take a look at the hip here, this is at a greater mechanical advantage on this side than it is over here. So basically you're putting yourself at a disadvantage, or you're putting your hip extensors at a disadvantage here. But comparing the knee angle, or the knee axis, over here it's at a pretty big mechanical disadvantage, whereas over here, because there's no lever arm length, the angle of flexion is much wider, you put yourself at a pretty big mechanical advantage over here compared to this side. So in short, you've made it much harder at your hip, but also much easier at your knee. The reason this happens is because invariably your hip extensors, the muscles involved in hip extension here, are always going to be stronger than the muscles involved in knee extension, your quads. It's universally true that the amount of force a muscle can produce is directly proportional to its cross-sectional area. Basically, that just means that the size of the muscle determines how much force it can produce. And we all know that our glutes and our hip extensors are very big, strong muscles, especially compared to our quads. And we can't really change that aspect of our physiology, but we can sort of minimize the difference. So the reason that we find ourselves in this position is just because coming from this bottom position, our knees or our knee extensors are not strong enough to push the bar upward while also extending at the hip. What tends to happen is, although this position here is much harder for your hip extensors are stronger anyway, so they can bear this sort of position and they can continue extension in most cases, unless you fail, obviously. They can continue extension upward from this position, even though it's mechanically disadvantageous. But it also makes it easier at your knee, so that you do have sufficient strength at this axis now to continue pushing the bar upward. So knowing all that, the question becomes, why would you not just squat like this? If this position, basically takes advantage of the strength of your hip extensors while also accounting for the weakness of your knee extensors, why would you not just allow yourself to squat this way? And you certainly could. A prime example is Lane Norton. He squats almost exactly like this. This wouldn't even be an exaggeration for him. No disrespect to Lane. But what you'll notice is that in this position, basically your limiting factor, what determines whether or not you can actually push that bar upward from this position is whether or not you can produce enough torque here at this axis of rotation. But you have to remember that you've put yourself at a big disadvantage here by increasing this angle of flexion and also increasing the length of this lever arm. Conversely, our ideal position, or my proposed ideal position over here, as you initiate your ascent compared to the starting position over here, if you take a look at the hip angle, this has become a little bit wider, the knee angle has also become a little bit wider, and the lever arm length at the hip and the knee have also become both shorter. So in this position, you've put one axis at a big disadvantage and one axis at a big advantage. In this position, you've put one at a more moderate advantage and the other at a more moderate advantage as well. So the limiting factor over here is essentially how much torque you can produce in a poor position over here at your hip at one axis, and your limiting factor over here, whether or not you can push the bar up, is determined by how much torque you can produce at two axes, your knee and your hip, which are both in stronger positions than at the starting point. So if we accept that this position is better than this position, we have to figure out how to avoid this and get closer and closer to this ideal. The first thing that we should consider is technical cues. So obviously, if you understand this idea, you understand that this is a better position, you can cue this position. The main cue, I would say, is hip extension. So out of the whole, your knees will invariably extend. What we're leaving out in this position, obviously, is hip extension along with knee extension. So you want your hips to extend as your knees extend, so the bar actually travels upward as your hips are rising. I mean, you could just tell yourself, hip extension. That might be a sufficient cue for you, but for a lot of people, I would say a better cue or a more effective cue would be chasing your hips forward or getting your hips traveling forward and your shoulders traveling back as you initiate your ascent. So what that would look like is, from here, it would be hips traveling forward and shoulders traveling back. So your torso is getting closer and closer to upright as the bar is rising upward. However, if it were really that simple as, just understanding this idea and cueing these positions, then myself and a lot of other people who are aware of this, we wouldn't have any trouble avoiding this position and being in this position. But it really isn't just that simple. The other half of the equation is having sufficient strength to actually find this position. Because, you can cue this position as much as you'd like to, but if you aren't strong enough to actually be in this position, obviously you'll never get there. This position basically reveals the differential in strength between hip extensors and knee extensors. In order to get closer to this position, what you'll need to do is sort of minimize that differential. I'm not saying that you shouldn't train your hip extensors at all, because that would be fairly ridiculous. You do need strong hip extensors to extend your hip, obviously, but in order to get closer to this position, your knee extensors need to become stronger in proportion to your hip extensors. Another factor in this whole thing is going to be abductor strength. We talked about earlier in this video that your hips sort of shoot up and back because your knees fall in and your apparent femur length increases. In order to keep this apparent femur length short, if you take a look here, this length here is about the same as this length here, whereas this length is quite a bit longer because your knees cave in. So if you can keep your knees out, or if you can hold your knees out there and maintain that angle of external femoral rotation, then that'll help to make sure that your hips don't shoot back. So the two things to work on then are knee extensor strength or quad strength and abductor strength. Now obviously there are a lot of ways to train those two muscles, but I would say the best way to isolate those muscles are going to be if you have an abduction machine at your gym. A lot of us call them bad girls, where basically seated in this machine and you shove your knees outward this way. probably your best choice for knee extensor strength is going to be leg extensions. The reason that I encourage you to use these two machines is just that you are training those two muscles directly without involvement from any other muscles. So it allows you to correct these imbalances faster than if you were to try to build knee extensor strength by doing like front squats or something else like that. So hopefully, if you understand this, give it enough time to train and build up the strength to maintain this position, you can eventually squat like this. Or like this. Just a couple more things before I end this video. The first and probably most important is just that I understand these videos, these biomechanics videos, are not the most entertaining. In fact, they're probably pretty boring, pretty dry, and maybe even hard to understand. But you have to consider that when it comes to actually increasing your numbers, you can change your technique a lot faster than you can actually build muscle and build strength. So becoming more efficient with your technique is probably the fastest way, or one of the fastest ways, to actually increase your total. So regardless of whether or not you actually learn from my videos, I encourage all of you out there to always try to be technically aware. Record your form, analyze it, figure out where you're making mistakes and where you could be more efficient, and fix it. Last thing, I just want to say a special thank you to everybody that sent in videos to help me produce this video. If I didn't use your video, it was probably because it either got to me too late, it was a format that my computer didn't work with, or maybe your form was too good to be used as an example. If you're not in the video, it's not because I don't love you or anything, but I appreciate it either way. If you want to purchase Tytanium Fitness apparel, go to tytaniumfitness.bigcartel.com. If you want to hire me as your online coach, shoot me an email at tytaniumfitnesscoaching@gmail.com. And lastly, if you want to buy my DUP-based program, again, shoot me an email at the same email address, just in the subject line include something about titanium DUP. That's about it for this video, guys. Sorry it was so long and boring, but I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.
Titanium.